Thank you, everyone, for your time and effort in coming here to listen to our conversation. And I'll also be reading to respond to your question, Professor Shyama. I would call myself an accidental academician because uh, I really wanted to become a writer from a very early age. And life took over, life circumstances take over. And when one does academically very well, I kind of got a tenured position in Delhi University at a very young age of 22. And I taught there for about 19 years or 20 years, and then moved to the US where my husband got posted. So, uh, uh, well, I have always wanted to become a writer, as I said. An academician, I guess it's, there are moments when I do think I wish I could have written more. Had I not done so well academically, I would have perhaps been able to write, devote more time to my writing. If you're teaching full time, and of course doing a lot of research as well, then where is the time to write? So I did, of course, I had been writing poetry from a very early age, from my teen years.
We notice an impressive diversity with regard to your choice of genres. What about the themes? Are they equally diverse or recurrent?
Well, borrowing from and being influenced by past writers. So it's very difficult for me to track down who exactly influenced me. Uh, in some ways, I'm still a very old-fashioned, I'm very old school, and I like the good old, though my postdoctoral work has been in postmodern literature, I still do like some good old modern writers.
Dr. Nishi's response to contemporary reality is evident in the poetry collection titled Iraq War Memorabilia. Mythology too finds place in her writing. She has written two long poems that are about 125 pages long, one on the Himalayas and the other on the river Ganges. She has also written two volumes of poetry focused on rethinking mythologies, on Indian women, Indian goddesses, and Indian men, Indian gods, where she has shown connections and parallels in their lives and experiences. She is offered to read from these right now.
Thank you. I have just taken some excerpts, printed out some excerpts. To come back to certain discursive aspects of what I've written, the historical and the mythological are somewhat integral aspects of poetry, and that's what I've foregrounded in two volumes of my poetry on Indian men, Indian gods, Indian women, Indian goddesses. And let me just I do kind of try to forge a new global identity by tracking parallels, connections, so to say, between certain well-known historic Western writers as well as certain Indian writers. Let me read out a poem. Almost two brothers, almost Varun and Poseidon. Varun is the Hindu god of oceans, the guardian of the dead in those waters, and Poseidon, the Greek god of the seas, was relied upon by sailors for a safe voyage. In our dreams, we enter the earth, we embrace it gracefully, expanding despite its meek calls and our competitive claims. Asur in a briefly altered space-time, then cling like those devas shooting arrows, to grind like our waves do, hour by fatal hour, to spit and chaw the last drops of our offering, until the last full morning rises up with the smell of reconnecting bones, a loose stretch of quivering mortality, gone soon. like the flying bone, like the ripened flesh on it, conceived by me in my flame of love, collapsing, enduring, eccentric reward of my rising temples, burst forth my lava into the handle of the earth, soaking its helpless watch, resembling it, as it stands firm in its faith, stern jury of our conscience, this sea of waiting answers, this broken path of our breath, pressing its fingers upon our broken bodies, the skin graying, tossed ashore like the twisted heap of clouds victorious. And I, Varun, returning from those remains, that sea of longing amassed in me, those bones levitating, raised above the din, paint myself my own directions, the wind measures, lifting me, fine as my fickleless feather foam, fulsome westward, and I, Poseidon, our mothers naming us in ancient lands that clutch upon the garrison wall, the smell of eternity, lose so much of its energy, my head sink from its own signs, my trident by design, wreak revenge, wreck, then create again, in right earnest, almost like brothers. The Caribbean writer Derek Walcott talked about rotting faggots of knowledge that need to be rejuvenated. And myth also, in order to find valency, in order to be validated, needs to be rejuvenated and creatively transformed into something new in poetry. So this is one example of the East meeting the West. Like poetry, myth is also intensely metaphorical. It translates feelings, so to say, into physical sensations. Should I go on? Should I read some more poems? Or
Can read a few more.
okay, okay. Let me read a poem, Bharat and Romulus. Bharat and Romulus, if you can track some similarity between the two of them. They are eponymous founders of two nations. Let me read the poem. This is like I'm trying to develop a cross-cultural aesthetic in my poetry, and that's why I'm showing you connections and parallels between two well-known mythical figures. The lioness blinks and grins, then takes his soft paw, lurches up, working her way through the child's hair. He falls asleep, indifferent to the damp, breathless rush, terror, the bleeding deer dragged, bleeding, bloody still. Shakuntala frets, desperate to cradle him in her nestling arms, sighs, then resumes her cooking. The hard sun stares. Then the wolves start crying, tangled in their damp den. Their son continues to play with his pack of chiseled stones. He does not question the hoof prints, the unequal gaits, the old-fashioned melodrama of the opening sky, the weight. The neighboring pack decides to join. The bronze melody of their song against the wind stirs and strangles the spoils. His brother rests while they free from the arrow descending, past yellow bunches, outside her torn shutters, potted singles. And Bharat rubs his mouth against the muzzle of the cub, throws mud at him in play, and the fireflies at dusk join in. And soon enough, they return to the faint sounds of crying. Baby Romulus is churlish. He growls wolf words. It is late August, and still no signs of an empire. Either the plan has veered off track, or they sit composing animal love. Adaptation becomes a tricky word. Why and when would an exile begin? Evolving selves wander onto tracks, differentiated.
You very beautifully brought out the common ground beneath superficial differences. Moving on to plays, historical figures seem to be favored. Churchill Among Savages, her seventh play, is an examination of Winston Churchill's role in the East, which has been extensively researched and documented. Glorified as a hero and revered in the West, he has also been held responsible for several purported misdoings committed in the former colonies of the British Empire. Reviews have rated as powerful the theme, script, dialogues, message, and satire, as also the way in which it attacks racism, cultural supremacy, and colonization. It explores important issues such as cultural appropriation, ethnic bias, social equality, and much more. And the setting straddles continents. Africa, India, and the Middle East are featured. Backed up by research of historical documents, the play examines and unveils ramifications lying hitherto hidden. Two short plays titled Mercy and The Strange Case of Normalcy focus on the body-mind nexus. Mercy depicts the indifference and lack of empathy of society towards AIDS patients who suffer isolation, rejection, and discrimination, while also exposing the shabby truth of the Indian medical community, which mistreats poor patients who cannot afford exorbitant medical expenses. And the strange case of normalcy engages in a subtle examination of how we live on the edge of normality. It's about the illusory quality of what we call the normal, in air quotes, and the blurring of its boundaries. 5 years of research and writing went into the trilogy of feminist plays, behind female grit and glory, dealing with the inner lives of major historical figures of South Asia. Nishi ma'am, could you tell us about the 3 women whose destinies grapple with their existential situation as gendered beings?
Well, I've always been very interested in strong women, and I challenged myself to write about Kasturba Gandhi, whose husband happens to be one of the most famous figures in human history, while Kasturba is virtually unknown. And if at all she's known as a very submissive, demure. That's the popular perception about Kasturba. And when I researched the life of Kasturba Gandhi, I found, much to my pleasant surprise, that she could hold forth on her own. She was a very strong woman who actually gave the concept of satyagraha to her husband, who also participated in and contributed enormously to the freedom struggle. So the play is a series of kind of confrontations between the husband and the wife, where where she's, in a way, she comes out as the more enlightened person who's trying to show her husband where he went wrong with, whether it was with their oldest son or with certain kind of experiments with truth, within quotes, so to say, that took him along his own singular path of, experimenting with his own inner self, in a way. That was one of the plays. I did write about Indira. That's Indira Gandhi, and I'm a very apolitical person. I didn't want to deal with the politics of, whether or not you agree with her, but the play, simply titled Indira, shows how women leaders are viewed through a different lens altogether. And so she definitely was kind of a very controversial figure, but the strong decisions that she made at critical moments, critical junctures in the Indian history, perhaps leads to open philosophical discussions about not just female leadership, which is a unique animal by itself, but also about I have also tried to use the trope of Greek drama to examine the idea of idealism. What is, how can we examine idealism within politics?
Coming back to poetry, we have a reading from her recently published collection. It's called From Immigrant Diaries. It tells us that, the blurb tells us that it's a diverse collection of poems on the lives, experiences, dilemmas, and existential situations of immigrants across the globe.
Thank you. I hope I'm not testing your patience, but having lived in the US for nearly 25 years and with the issue of immigration being somehow very pertinent, I just happened to chance upon, I thought I would like to write about the existential dilemmas, the tensions, so to say, within within the idea of cultural dislocation, and also show the lives of immigrants. So this very recently published book titled From Immigrant Diaries, these poems, so to say, tell the stories of people who left their homelands to start a new life. And so the poems, of course, straddle multiple worlds, multiple languages also. They witness border crossings, new beginnings, acts of racism and discrimination, and homelessness, and a sense of isolation as well. Let me read a poem called A Kind of Identity Remorse. Locke, that's John Locke, a well-known Western philosopher, Locke wrote about it as a kind of psychological continuity that seems like Auribus teneo lupum, that is, a concept in Latin, Auribus teneo lupum, the proof for migration patterns displacing the idea of what existed before and after, like everything being rooted out. Is there a kind of totem pole that draws in a confrontation? Those kind of necessary and sufficient conditions that the cultural doctor draws out as felix culpa from our innards, perhaps when you almost think differently, brown, white, black. The colors are still the same, coral bells, a chicory, forget-me-not, or a purple calla lily, chocolate cosmos, black dahlia, white dahlia, black pansy, black petunia. The sun will bloom them all, plant them whither you will. Where the Cartesian constructions divide us, Locke would find proof enough for the classical elements to stay the same. Plant them where you will. A new identity will not flame, nor will philosophy change a granite essence. Nor do we need the former bridges from rolling up when tongues and accents change, unearth new clothing, bring in new consciousness, sometimes rusted out, discriminate by the intensity of the sun's blaze. The grass may have overgrown, the weeds pulled out, disingenuously, the proof that we are still the same, inspired into new relationships, stories that will survive. Blessed are they who never left their homeland. Just one more? Okay. Let me read a poem simply titled "Rooted," and of course, the diaspora all across the world, whoever's witnessed being uprooted, unrooted, so to say, and being displaced and dislocated, would understand the idea of rooted. And of course, along with that, the idea of identity as an immigrant. So, poem titled Rooted. We see them for a moment, those kernels, and then they disappear, teasing us with their material content, leaving us with a kind of dissatisfaction, underground nodes of ourselves, cut off, exploded, multiplied. Then, having read about Aswatha, the cosmic tree in divine self-regard, we may reverse direction, hanging on with supernatural force, live loose forever, otherwise alone, adrift. There is always a horizontal axis. The axis has always been there, holding up toward the blue sky and the brown earth, carefully diagrammed, sometime pushed vertically up the way the branches grow, neither cut down nor up, but fall naturally, footloose at the beginning, when those guardian angels go amick absolutely. They have the gift of reminding you that the amplitude of life runs a downward course, hardly improved by sharing thoughts. Only memories blend, puzzled, gathered. They come into being, then pass out their vascular order in leaves, branches, veins. Their ancient wisdom gets distributed, nor neglect the hidden secrets enshrined. We collect data of good and evil, trace their link with the underworld land of the dead. We become their diverse voices, skins, race, untethered when the trunk separates.
So that was a collection concerning the promises and pitfalls of migration. Is there time for one question from the audience? Okay. So I think because we have run out of time, we wind up. So thank you for being a great audience. Thank you.
Thank you for
Happy
your
to
patience.
hear from you,
and
ma'am.
Thank you for your time.
So thank you for spending your precious time for us. Moving on to Memento.